All right, good evening. Welcome to Introduction to Judaism 5781 here at Temple Emmanuel. Today's topic is Passover, everybody's favorite spring holiday, which is coming up in just moments, it seems. If you're not already picking up your supplies for Passover, it's time to get on it. If you're a procrastinator like I know I can be, it's time to get out there and do the Passover shopping. Make sure you've got matzah, make sure you've got everything that you need, goodies and so forth, everything that you need for a wonderful Passover meal.
Lobster, ham, pork.
We're having turkey.
So we're going to jump right into it. I've already started the recording, by the way. Uh, so hold on to the comments. We will always have an opportunity for comments at the end. Let's start at the very beginning. Let's look at Passover in the Torah. Seems like a good place to start. Let's begin Exodus chapter 12. There's a lot that Exodus says, especially in chapter 12, about what Passover is, or at least what it was in the times of the Torah. This month shall mark for you, meaning this month, the month we're in, the beginning of the months, it shall be the first of the months of the year for you. How can it be the first month when we had Rosh Hashanah way back in September or something like that? Well, we have multiple new years. We recently celebrated Tu B'Shvat, which we call the New Year for the trees. That's not the only new year. In fact, there are 4 new years that we celebrate. There's the New Year for years, which is Rosh Hashanah, uh, the Jewish New Year. There's also a New Year for months, a New Year for trees, and a New Year for other things. We don't really use the last one anymore. How can we have more than one New Year? It's not that complicated. If you have a fiscal New Year, a lot of companies do a lot of business in December, and so instead of trying to do all the finances in December immediately following all of these big changes, they'll say we're going to have our financial year that starts on July 1st, ends on June 30th, and that's our financial new year, our fiscal year, right? We also have school years. I know a lot of you are teachers, and that means that your year also starts somewhere around September and goes through, sometime in May, and that's a different type of new year. So this idea of multiple New Years is really not that complicated or foreign, but Nisan, the month that we are in now, which by the way is not a name that comes from the Torah, it's a name that comes along a lot later. This is the first of the months. On the 10th of the months, each of them shall take a lamb, every single family, a lamb for each household. You shall keep watch over it until the 14th day of the month. And all the assembled congregation of the Israelites shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they are to eat it. They shall eat the flesh the same night. They shall eat it roasted over fire, with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. So already we can see there are some similarities and some differences when we look at the biblical Passover and compare it with how we celebrate today. So for one, we no longer go out and find a lamb and slaughter it, or find a lamb on the 10th of the month and slaughter it on the 14th. That's not something we do anymore. We no longer smear blood on the doorposts, although many of you have a mezuzah, which is connected to this tradition. If you don't have a mezuzah, give me a call and we'll get a mezuzah. We'll do a nice blessing. We can even say a blessing over some matzah and make it a real sacred occasion if we're doing it during Passover. They shall eat the flesh the same night, roasted over fire. So it's not a stew, it's got to be roasted. We still have a connection to that tradition of roasting. In particular, most Seder plates you'll find a roasted egg and a roasted bone that call back to this tradition. The date is still the same. We celebrate it at the same time that we're used to celebrating, whether we're in the Bible or we're talking about modern times. But there's no description here of a Seder plate, no description here of a Passover Seder, other than the fact that it says there should be a meal. One other interesting thing that you see right here at the bottom is eat it with unleavened bread, which of course we still do, and bitter herbs. There's a Mahloket. Remember, a Mahloket is the word for a disagreement. A Mahloket about whether it's one or two bitter herbs on the plate. Most Seder plates that you find today have been fairly standardized. They have 6 spaces, and 2 of those spaces are reserved for different bitter herbs. One for maror, which is usually horseradish, although there are different traditions, and one for chazeret, which is usually romaine lettuce, although again there are different traditions there as well. It could be celery, or it could be different type of leafy green. There's different traditions from different parts of the world, different times in history. So the question is, because it says bitter herbs, because it's in the plural, some of the rabbis, which of course are writing thousands of years after this text takes place, some of the rabbis, of the early rabbis, said, well, it's plural, so you've got to have at least 2 different ones. Another says, well, that's, what do you call a collection of herbs? If you've got one piece of horseradish and you got another piece of horseradish, you would call that plural. So it's just the fact that you're mixing different herbs together, or mixing the same herb, together in some quantity. So you will find on a lot of Seder plates that are 50 years old, 100 years old, you'll find just one spot for a bitter herb. There's no chazeret, that there is just one spot, and that is for maror. Exodus 12 continues. This is how you shall eat it. Now talking about the sacrifice. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it hurriedly. It is a Passover offering to Adonai. So here's an instruction that's very specific in the Torah, although it's one that we don't follow. And in fact, even in temple times, this does not seem to have been part of the tradition. I did have one teacher when I was a student in rabbinical school. Before he was a teacher, he served at a congregation, and he said, in my congregation, I told everyone, bring your belts and your backpack and your walking stick, because that's what it says. You gotta be prepared for dressing up in this costume of your ancestors. And in case you're confused, it does say that this is the tradition for all time. So if you're not wearing your running shoes, if you're not wearing your belt, if you're not wearing or backpack, if you're not carrying your walking stick, then you're violating Passover. That was what my teacher said. He was an interesting guy with a lot of very strong opinions. He's also the same one that I mentioned months and months ago, who actually brought in 2 goats to the synagogue on Yom Kippur. So just to give you kind of a picture of what sort of fellow he is. He also, by the way, loves Passover, or at least he seems to love Passover, because he creates a new Haggadah from scratch every single year, and it's always a beautiful Haggadah that he creates. Exodus, same chapter, continues a little bit later. You shall celebrate it as a festival to Adonai throughout the ages, as an institution for all time. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. We still do that today. On the very first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. We kind of do that. We do that the day before Passover starts. Whoever eats leavened bread from the first day to the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. You shall celebrate a sacred occasion on the first day. We still do that. And a sacred occasion on the seventh day. We still do that, but in a different kind of way. No work shall be done on them, and only what every person is to eat, that alone may be prepared for you. So you can cook food, but you can't, or prepare food or set it out. But it's a chag, meaning it's a festival with particular rules and no other work you can do. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your ranks out of the land of Egypt. You shall observe this day throughout the ages as an institution for all time. A little bit later on in Leviticus, we read again, these are the appointed seasons of Adonai, even holy convocations, which ye, excuse my old translation here, proclaim in the appointed season. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at dusk, is a Passover for Adonai. By the way, the word Passover here is Pesach. You'll see that anywhere you see Passover in a translation, that probably says Pesach in the Hebrew, which of course is the Hebrew name for the holiday. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto Adonai. 7 days you shall eat, or ye shall eat, unleavened bread. By the way, older translations of the Tanakh, this is the 1917 JPS translation. Why do they use ye and you? Because in the Hebrew there is a difference between whether it is ye, meaning you personally, or you meaning y'all. If we had a really good translation, it would say y'all instead of you, right? Some rabbi needs to do the Texas Bible. We can translate the whole the whole Tanakh. Later on in the book of Numbers, and in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, is a Passover for Adonai. On the 15th day of this month shall be a feast. We still do that, that's for sure. 7 days shall unleavened bread be eaten. So that's all we get, by the way. Oops, going the wrong way. That's all we get, by the way, in the Tanakh. There are a couple of other passages about it that mostly repeat these same things. So what do we know the Israelites, our ancestors were doing in biblical times? How were they celebrating this festival? Well, number one, they were all getting together in Jerusalem. I skipped some of those passages. They show up later in Kings and in, I want to say Ezekiel. I would have to double check where the other descriptions of temple celebrations show up. We know that they were getting together in Jerusalem. We know that they were getting a goat or a lamb that they were then offering up, that they watch over it for those 4 days leading up to Passover. You've got to prepare in advance. They were roasting it and then eating it in their own homes. We know that they ate unleavened bread for 7 days. And we know that was the tradition, and there was a big feast on the first day of Passover. Those traditions we still follow, but there are other traditions that we don't. Even in biblical times, the practice of Passover changed from one era to the next. So let's jump forward to the next major era of Jewish custom. My clicker is not clicking. Okay. Is the battery dead? Okay. Goodbye, clicker. So let's jump on to the next major era of Jewish practice. We're going to look at Passover in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is where we have the Magid, the story of Passover. That's the major discussion in the Mishnah. It says, what do you do on Passover? You tell the story of Passover. This is where the earliest version of the Seder is created. When was the Mishnah written? Does anybody remember? Do you have it in your notes? You have to go back and look at those Jewish texts. The Mishnah was written in the 2nd century. Parts of the Mishnah are believed to be earlier than that. Some of them may be centuries earlier before they were collected and written down. But the earliest known writing down of the Mishnah is the 2nd century. So we can say it's probably a reflection of what people thought and believed and thought was important in the 2nd century of the Common Era. So that's the 100s, right? That's the first time that we see a description of a Passover Seder. The Passover Seder itself is described in the Mishnah, and it is designed to be a self-describing ritual. If you want to know why we do the ritual, you do the ritual and then you'll understand. It explains itself as you go along. The ritual is to tell the story of Passover. So if you wonder what is it that we're celebrating, well, part of the ritual is to describe what we're celebrating, to describe the Exodus from Egypt, the story of the escape from slavery in Egypt to the freedom, the redemption of freedom in the wilderness, and how this entire story happened with Moses and with plagues and the parting of the seas, all of that stuff built into the ritual itself. The ritual, by the way, is modeled after the Roman formal meal. If you've ever been to a formal meal, you know that there are a lot of rules, that things happen sort of in a particular order. There's a certain, order where you put the cups. You have to put the silverware in a particular order. There's one fork for fish and a different fork for dessert. Actually, the fork should be on this side, on the left, right? At least if you're in America or Europe, you've got it on the left. You've got the big fork for dinner. You've got a smaller fork for salad. Sometimes even a smaller fork for fish, or I forget which fork is which. Somebody who knows those things, you can call me up and tell me afterwards. Well, it was no different almost 2,000 years ago. It's very important to put that almost in there because it was not a ritual that existed 2,000 years ago, as far as we know. It was created less than 2,000 years ago. So almost 2,000 years ago, there were still formal dinners, but we were not living as we are now as Jews under sort of a European mindset and a European history. Most of our customs, as independent as we are as Americans and especially as Texans, we still owe an awful lot of our language, our culture, our understanding of our place in history to Europeans. Even, architecture, clothing, all of this is European in origin, right? Well, our formal dinners for sure are based on European rules, even if there is a slightly different variation between European and continental, as the fancy people call it. The major cultural force in Judea 2,000 years ago and in the centuries that followed were the Romans. And so the Roman banquet was the model for a celebratory meal. A lot of the things that show up in the Mishnah that don't make a lot of sense to us today because we're no longer familiar with the formal Roman banquet. And so the idea of why do we sit on a pillow and lean to one side? How is that a symbol of a free person? Shouldn't a free person be sitting up properly in their chair? Well, that would make sense in today's understanding, but in Roman times, only a free citizen was allowed to go to a banquet and lounge. You picture all those old, golden era Hollywood movies where the Roman emperor is laying down and surrounded by pillows. That's the idea of leaning against a pillow, whereas a slave would not be permitted to do that. The Roman banquet also involved dipping different types of foods. So when we say on all other nights, ma nishtanaha lai lahazeh, why is this night different from all other nights? One of the questions is, on all other nights, we do not dip our food even once. If you go back and you look in the Mishnah, that's not how the question is phrased. It says, why on all other nights we dip our food only once? So how did this dipping foods in other foods come about? Again, it's based on the formal Roman banquet when there was a appetizer type thing where you would dip once, but on Passover, it's a special ritual, so we dip twice. It's also important to understand a lot of the different pieces of the Seder, including the afikomen, a Greek word, were based on these traditions of the Hellenistic world, the Greeks and the Romans and the prevailing culture of that time. Again, we're talking almost 2,000 years ago during the composition of the Mishnah. Some of the features that we see in this ritual that is first described in the Mishnah, this question and answer. Why is this night different from all other nights? That's good. That's a good learning practice. If you're trying to teach your children about Passover, having a part of the Passover Seder, a question and answer session that you're ritually required, according to the rabbis, to have this question and answer session as part of your Seder, guess what? Your kids are going to learn what the Seder is. It's interactive. We say something and then we do it. We talk about the plagues and we take a drop of wine out of our cup for each of the plagues. Usually use a pinky finger or the end of a spoon. So it's interactive. We talk about the matzah, then we eat the matzah. This means it's fun for all ages. There's activities for the kids. There's question and answer. There's somewhere we get to say, you're a good kid and you're a wicked kid because of the way that you ask your questions. It is fun for grown-ups because there's 4 glasses of wine. It's fun for all ages. It is ritually distinct. Now this is important because any ritual that's not distinct is forgettable. If you want something to be memorable, this is great advice for teachers out there. Make it something that's so strange and bizarre, so unusual that it will be memorable for years to come. I'll tell you, if you've never been to a Seder before, the first time you go to a Seder, you're never going to forget it. It is such a strange ritual that it makes it more memorable. We talked about this idea a little bit when we were talking about Sukkot. Why is Sukkot such a strange collection of traditions? Well, some of that strangeness is what makes them so special and endearing and distinct. It is inclusive. It incorporates, if you're, fun, I'm picturing like the old Milton Bradley games where it would say fun for ages 4 to 104. And then you turn 105 and you can't play with it anymore, right? Which brings me to the cultural significance of Passover. We talk a lot about what things mean for Judaism in this course, because it is, after all, an introduction to Judaism, but we don't always go into as much depth discussing the significance to Jews. This is a subtle but important distinction. Look at this. 70%, this is American Jews, 70% of Jews go to a Seder or participate in a Seder in some capacity every single Passover. Compare that with 53% who fast for Yom Kippur. Compare that with only 23% who say they regularly light candles for Shabbat. These numbers seem almost counterintuitive. I would say the most important ritual is Shabbat, and the most basic celebration of Shabbat is lighting candles on Friday night. I think anybody would agree with me on that one. And yet, fewer than a quarter of American Jews actually do that. Just over half of American Jews actually fast for Yom Kippur. But even of those who don't light candles, who don't fast for Yom Kippur, still a lot of them, 70% in total, go to a Seder every single year. This has been compared to like the Jewish Thanksgiving, that it is such an important family ritual that there is just no way you would think of missing it. How would you possibly look at your grandma the next year? These numbers, by the way, among Reform Jews, 76% go to a Seder every year. Again, slightly more fast for Yom Kippur, slightly less light candles, which is a little bit unusual. But there you have it. This is according to Pew Research. It's a few years old, but probably still bears, something close to this. For comparison, in Israel, Israeli Jews, 93% go to a Seder every single year. And remember, most Israeli Jews are secular. Even Jews who are not religious still find a way to go to a Seder. My very first Passover in Israel, I was staying with a friend of mine in Beersheba, who is a scientist who had really no interest in religious Judaism. And I went with him to a Seder that was, this is the same friend who when I said, oh, I'm in Israel, can you take me to the Kotel, to the Western Wall, to the most significant site in Judaism, who looked at me and said, why would you want to go there? It's just a wall. So that same friend who had no interest in religious Judaism whatsoever, to the point where he couldn't even see the point of why I would even want to go to the Kotel, still he was at a Seder with his family and took me as well. It was on a military base, which was very interesting because they normally that would be an impossible place for an American to go, but because it was Passover, whoever was on the gate was just like, yeah, go through. We don't care. Just keep going. We know why you're here. And it was a really incredible and meaningful experience, and memorable, as we said before. But that's the significance for Jews of Passover. It is the most celebrated, the most observed tradition, the Seder meal, among Jews around the world, and probably for many centuries. Although we don't have this kind of data from 300 years ago, we don't know what people were doing, but we know that it's for sure, at least we can say for sure today and likely in the past, the Passover Seder is the most significant ritual of the entire calendar year for most Jews. It's not the most significant holiday in Judaism, but it's the most significant for many Jews. All right, let's talk about matzah. This stuff down here is a little bit of a mystery. We'll get there in a second. Did you read about this? Do you know what that is? All right, so first of all, what is matzah? Before we can answer what is matzah, we have to say what is leaven or leavening. What is chametz? The Bible says there's no chametz. No leaven is allowed. No leavening or leaven. There are different translations. What is chametz? Well, this is an important question to answer. If you're trying to follow the customs of Passover, you need to know what it is that's forbidden. What does it mean to eat no leavened bread, no chametz, nothing that's leavened? Well, according to Jewish tradition, as outlined in, framed in the Torah and outlined in detail in the Mishnah and Talmud, which follows, as well as codes, etc., etc. All of those texts that we studied. If by now you don't have this evolution in your mind, you've got the Torah, you've got the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, including the prophets and the writing, and then after that, a couple, centuries later, you've got the Mishnah. A couple hundred years later, you've got the completed Talmud. A couple hundred years later, you've got Jewish codes. This is the progression you should always have in your mind for anything that we're talking about by this point. So this is outlined what is chametz. The way it's defined in the Talmud is basically like this. It is any flour which has touched water for more than 18 minutes. So how do you make unleavened bread? You mix the flour and the water. You cook it as a dough. From the time the water and the flour touch until it's fully cooked, you've got 18 minutes. Now, of course, matzah in the ancient world was not the squares that we're used to seeing today. That was invented in Cincinnati by Manischewitz, who created this great system for making matzah in a machine. It had never been done before. It was all made by hand before that point, which meant if you can get a machine to do it, it's going to be a lot faster and a lot cheaper, and you can do it in the right amount of time. So before the big triangles, before the big squares of matzah came out, I did pass kindergarten, I promise. Before the big squares of matzah come out, these were handmade. Now you can still get handmade matzah. It's called shmura matzah, but it follows most of the same customs and traditions. Other than being round, tastes a little bit different because it's made with a little bit of a different type of flour, and the way the grain is harvested to the way that it's ground are a little bit different. But it's more or less the same. It's still hard, crunchy. It's got rows of holes in it. That's the matzah we're used to seeing. We now know that this was not what matzah was like to people hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, that there was soft matzah, there was thick matzah. As long as it was fully cooked within 18 minutes, that was considered matzah. We know this, by the way, because the Talmud talks about what happens if you get your matzah and your leavened bread mixed up. Well, that seems crazy to us. How could you ever, if I've got a piece of challah here and I've got a piece of matzah here, it would be impossible to mix them up. Even if I pulverize them both to crumbs, which is how we get matzah meal, used for cooking a lot of Passover dishes, it would be impossible to mix them up. But we know that originally, challah was probably more like a pita bread, more like a flat bread, not totally like a cracker, but sort of a flatter bread, because that's the type of bread that exists even today in that part of the world. And we know that unleavened bread was the same. It just didn't have yeast or any leavening added to it. It's only flour and water. That's the second requirement for matzah, is it cannot have any other ingredients. If you go to the store, sometimes you'll see egg matzahs, which are usually marked, if you look at the corner of the box, it'll say not kosher for Passover. Whether or not you decide to use it anyway is up to you. And the truth is, you can actually add egg as an ingredient for certain circumstances. We won't get into all of those laws right now. There is such a thing as kosher for Passover matzah with eggs or with seasonings, all of these things that you'll find. But the matzah that is to be used for the Passover Seder, which is what it says, kosher for Passover means it's also kosher to use during the Seder, has to be just flour and water, only those two ingredients, 18 minutes from the time that the flour and the water touch until the time that it's fully cooked. What is kitniot? Well, if you are connected with Ashkenazi Judaism, you got to know what kitniot is. In our community here, we have a mixture because folks here have come from all over the world, and that means that's no different in the Jewish community. We have members of the Jewish community who come from all over the world. Some come from Sephardic background, some come from Ashkenazi background. And for Ashkenazi Jews, remember how we said the Shulchan Aruch, this is another one that should be in your notes, was the last code of Jewish law that everyone agreed on. It was not the last code of Jewish law. There were additional codes of Jewish law that got into more specificity or made rulings on things that the Shulchan Aruch doesn't address. One of those later halachic works asks this question: what if there's something that you're not sure if it's flour or not? Because in Europe, apparently it was not uncommon to have different types of bread made from non-grain flours, made from potato flour in more recent centuries, made from other starches, made from beans. That's what I was thinking of. You can take beans, you can grind it up into a flour, and you can cook with it. In fact, a lot of health foods that you'll find, say, bread, made from bean flour. What about almond flour? They may have had almond flour. I don't know. I think that's a more recent thing. I could be wrong. But we know that you can make flour from things other than grain. So they say, well, what if you have? The Talmud does talk about almond milk, by the way. It says if you're drinking almond milk, you should have some almonds nearby on the table so people can see you're drinking almond milk, and wouldn't think that you're drinking milk and having meat. Anyway, these are the types of laws that were created in Europe to govern, to make sure, not only make sure that nobody was going to inadvertently violate Passover or other dietary laws, but also to make sure that nobody would mistake somebody that they saw who might be doing something correctly and might mistake them for doing something wrong, right? Think about the almond milk. So the rabbis of Europe, in their later codes, specified and said anything that resembles flour is also forbidden. So that includes beans, that includes a lot of other vegetables that are sort of like beans, that includes rice and corn. All of those things are kitniot, which means during Passover, there's something that could be mistaken for leaven. They could be used as flour, or they could be mistaken as some type of bread. And so those are also forbidden for Ashkenazi Jews. This makes it very interesting. You notice I mentioned corn. Do you know how many things include corn as an ingredient? Cornstarch or corn flour, corn syrup. It's in everything. Some people wait all year long to get the kosher Coca-Cola with the green cap, or the yellow, I think it's yellow, with the yellow cap. Somebody will Google it and tell me the right color. That's kosher for Passover because it's made with real sugar. Sugar cane is fine, but corn syrup, because it's made from corn, which is kitniot, is not kosher for Passover, at least not for all Jews. If you're Sephardic, well, it's really nice. You don't have to worry about all this stuff. You can have rice, you can have beans, you can have other type, legumes, other types of things that are very enjoyable to eat, and you'll enjoy on Passover. You have to get rid of all this chametz, all of the leavening, all of the crumbs, every bit of cracker, every bit of dust, every bit of crumbs of bread, cereal. Everything has to be cleaned out of your house, because it says in the Torah, like we just read, it says no leavening was allowed in your settlements, in your homes or in your settlements. So that's where this picture here comes in. It is the traditional way to search for chametz. This is, by the way, if you've got kids, you've got to do this year. It is a great way to give them an activity. It'll take up the whole afternoon. it gets them involved, and you can do it in your own home. It's COVID safe, right? You take a paper bag, you take some crumbs of bread, you take a feather, a wooden spoon, and a candle. Step one is you hide those pieces of bread around your house. Make sure that you remember, probably write down a list of everywhere that you hid the pieces of bread, because you don't want to say, okay, I hid 10 pieces of bread and they show up with 9, and you're like, well, where's the last one? And you can't find it. So make a list of where you hid all the little pieces of bread. Or if you've got a cell phone, you can just take a picture on your cell phone that shows where each piece of bread was hidden. That's an even easier way to do it. And then you can go back through the photos and say, okay, we found that one, found that one. Then you send the kids out. And if you've got a couple of kids, you give the oldest one the candle, because you're supposed to search for the chametz by lamp, by a flame. That's what the Talmud specifies. And it's an interesting discussion of why these particular things, but that's for a whole nother time. So you take the oldest kid can hold the candle and you sort of shine it around. The younger kids, you give the bag, the feather, and the spoon, and they use the feather to scoop it onto the spoon. They use the spoon to put it into the bag. And then the kids' favorite part comes at the end, because you take that bag with the chametz, you put it somewhere safe, maybe in the barbecue pit, and you burn it. You burn up all of the last chametz in your house. Kids love it. Make sure you do it safely. But it's a great way. I think it's an incredible tradition. I think every family should do that this year. It is like such a great activity for COVID. Let's talk about Passover on the calendar. What does it mean to be the first month? We already talked about that. It's the month of Nisan, the month of springtime. Passover is either 7 days or 8 days. Does anybody remember why? This is, again, you can go back in your notes. You can find very easily, when we're talking about the calendar, we talked about why some holidays have an extra day. Why do we have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah? Why do we have a first night and a second night Seder? Why do we have 2 holidays? Well, it's because in ancient times, if you were not in the land of Israel, if you were not close to Jerusalem, it was difficult to know when the new moon was, and therefore when the new month started. And if you didn't know the exact date, and the Bible says you've got to celebrate this holiday on a certain date, then, well, I know it's either Monday or Tuesday, but I can't be sure which one it is. I'll celebrate both. And that's exactly why anywhere outside of the land of Israel, most Jews celebrate 8 days of Passover. Another interesting aside and interesting factoid, many Reform Jews have said, okay, this whole idea that we don't know what date it is, it's a myth. We know the dates. I've got, the app on my phone. It tells me the Hebrew dates. So we don't need to worry about that anymore. Many Reform congregations celebrate 1 day of Rosh Hashanah, not 2. Celebrate 1 day of most holidays. And yet, because of this endurance of Passover tradition and the way that it fits into the Jewish cultural context, many Reform congregations and many Reform Jews still celebrate 8 days of Passover, even if they don't celebrate an extra day on any other holiday of the year. That's just an interesting aside, something that I've noticed. That's why we have a first and second night Seder. That's why we celebrate 8 days of Passover. Unless you're living in the land of Israel, then you only get 1 Seder and you only get 7 days of Passover before you can go and have your pasta and pizza and all of those things. All right, I'm going to try to go pretty quickly through the Seder, but there's a lot of stuff here. So what do you need for a Seder? You got to have a Haggadah. You got to have candles. You got to have a Kiddush cup and anything else you need for Kiddush, the wine, the juice, etc. A separate Elijah's cup. We'll talk about that in a minute. Of course, you need the matzah. It's called Chag HaMatzot, the festival of unleavened bread. You need a Seder plate. Really, you can use any plate you like. In fact, you can find plates with sections in them pretty easily to use as a Seder plate if you can't find a proper Seder plate. You need a washing bowl. There are different traditions around washing, but in most cases, you need a bowl of water. That means you also need a towel that goes with it. Salt water, you got to prepare that in advance. The best way to make salt water I've found is to actually heat the water up, add the salt, make it extra salty, and then you can add cold water until it's just salty enough for your particular taste. So start off with like a concentrated, super salty water that's hot, and then as you add water, it'll cool down, and it also gets to the right salination. I'm using my $5 college words. It'll get to the right the right saltiness. All right, the Seder itself, for the setup. At the head of the table, you should have, by the way, I know I'm going through this part pretty quickly. Everything that you're seeing here is in documents that I'll be sending out in the weekly email this coming week with some tips and recipes for celebrating Passover. So if I'm going too fast for you to write this down, get down the most important parts, but you'll be able to see all of this in a couple of days when that email goes out. If you're not on Temple Emmanuel's email list, let me know, rabbi@temple-emmanuel.com. And I'll make sure that you're added to the list. You can also text me, I'm very easy to get a hold of. So you want to have, oops, I went too far. You want to make sure that you have 2 holiday candles. It can be any type of candles for the most part, but you can use Shabbat candles. Usually if you buy Shabbat candles, they'll say Shabbat v'Yom Tov, which means it's good for Shabbat or holidays, that it meets all of the requirements. If all you've got are birthday candles, yeah, why not? Who am I to stop you? Put out 2 candles. On your Seder plate, you've got a roasted egg, parsley, roasted shank bone, charoset, which is a sweet mix of usually apples and nuts, although it can be figs and nuts. There are different recipes for charoset. In fact, if you Google recipes for charoset, you'll get about 50 results. Find the one that you like the best. A bitter leaf lettuce. I'm talking too fast. I'm trying to get through everything. Bitter lettuce leaf, whole or grated horseradish. As a kid, I always had grated horseradish. After I became a rabbi, they told me, no, it's got to be a whole piece of horseradish, so you see the horseradish or it doesn't count. I don't know. You got to have a cup or a goblet for blessing. That's a kiddush cup. An extra cup or goblet, an extra cup set aside for Elijah. By the way, you don't need special cups for these things. If all you've got are the dollar store plastic cups, you can do it. There's no requirement that the cup be a particular type of cup. Although some people do have separate dishes just for Passover. If you are keeping kosher or you're intending to keep kosher on a fairly rigorous level, you'll have a whole separate set of dishes for Passover so that they are clean of any chametz. They're not contaminated by any chametz that could be in the house. You'll need 3 matzahs and a cover. You can buy beautiful matzah covers that have 3 pockets sort of in them. They're sewn in a particular way and they have pockets for the 3 matzahs, beautiful designs on the front. Or you can just use a napkin. If you fold it over and then fold it over again, you'll have your 3 pockets. A bowl of water for hand washing, and of course the towel that goes with it. When you're setting up the table around at each place, you're going to want to have a few Passover matzahs spread out. Each person will have anywhere from 1 to 3 matzahs, depends on how much they like matzah. So if you're figuring, if you're planning your own Seder or planning a mini Seder from your own home, or you're joining with someone over Zoom, like I'll be doing with my family, these are the things you should have on your table. Put around a few bottles of wine or grape juice so people can refill the cups, because we refill it 3 times because we drink 4 cups, right? So we fill it 4 times, but we refill it. Okay. You want to have small bowls of salt water for dipping. This can be at each person's place, or it can be sort of just spread out around the table. water, juice, whatever people are going to want to drink. And at each person's place, every single person should have a Haggadah, which tells them the service of what's happening, a pillow for reclining. Some families, only the Seder leader has a pillow. When I was growing up, everybody had a pillow. I went to a Seder once where the entire Seder was conducted on the floor and everybody sat on pillows, and it was really neat. Each person should have an individual plate with the charoset, the parsley, boiled egg, and horseradish so that they can do those parts of the Seder. You don't have to have a complete Seder plate for each person. We don't eat the bone, thank goodness. I don't know how we would do that. That would be pretty unpleasant. So you only need one on your main Seder plate, but you will want so there are certain things that not everybody needs, but you will want to make sure everybody has these things on their plate. A small dish of salt water for dipping, or as I said, you can place a few around the table. Some people, think it'll make less mess if you have just one for each person. A cup for wine or juice. By the way, as I've said many times, and you'll hear me repeat, the Talmud is explicit in the fact that wine and grape juice are indistinguishable from one another for ritual purposes. You can use wine or juice, it does not matter. Grape juice specific, you can't use apple juice, I'm sorry. If you're allergic to grapes, I don't know, we'll have to figure something out. And just the regular place setting for the meal. Okay. Some foods you might think about serving: matzah ball soup, brisket, roasted chicken, gefilte fish, kosher for Passover macaroons. The order of the Seder. The word Seder, what does it mean? This is in all of your readings. If there's only one lesson that every religious school student walks away, what does Seder mean? Seder means order, right? Seder means order. If that's not in your notes, if that's not already in your head, that's an important one to have written down. The order of the Seder, which is a way of saying the order of the order, because there's a particular order to the meal. Kadesh, Orchatz, Karpas. There's even a song, Kadesh, Orchatz, Karpas, Yachatz. Breaking the matzah, Magid, telling the story of the Exodus. Rachza, washing before the meal. Motzi matzah. Why do we wash twice? That's a whole nother discussion. The rabbis have a disagreement about when we're supposed to wash and when we're supposed to bless. We know that in rabbinic Judaism and in traditional Judaism, you wash your hands ritually before every meal. And what signifies a meal is if you're eating bread. In this case, matzah, lachma anya, the bread of affliction, it still counts as bread. If it didn't count as bread, it wouldn't be matzah. So ritually speaking, it still counts as bread. You do all the same things. The blessing that you say over the matzah is still hamotzi lechem min haaretz. There's an additional blessing for the matzah because it is fulfilling a special commandment. But you still say hamotzi lechem min haaretz. So the question is, when do you wash your hands? Well, some people say you wash your hands right before the motzi, right before you have the matzah, which would be the rachza right here. Other rabbis said, no, you have to wash before you eat even one thing, before you have the karpas, the green vegetable. And so you wash the compromise that they came to. This went back and forth. This was a mahloket. What does the word mahloket mean? A principled disagreement. Mahloket is one of those words that you just have to know. There's a mahloket about when you wash your hands, and so the rabbis could not resolve this. They said, here's what we'll do. Before you have the karpas, we'll have urchatz, where you wash your hands, but you don't say the blessing. That's the compromise. And then the rachza, where you wash your hands and you say the blessing before eating the matzah. So the compromise, should we do it this way or that way? And the answer was yes. the maror, bitter herbs, korech, the Hillel sandwich, shulchan aruch, that's the meal. That's the part everybody, when you turn the page and you see shulchan aruch, everybody starts getting really giddy. They're like, okay, finally we can eat some real food. Tzafon literally means out of hiding, and the berach, the blessing after the meal. Finally, you have songs of praise, Hallel. There are specific prescribed songs that you're supposed to sing that constitute Hallel, but this often includes a lot of additional songs that we'll talk about in a minute. Last but not least is Nirtzah, Lashana Haba'a B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. This is the end of the meal, or the end of the Seder. So why do we have 4 cups during the Seder? Well, there's a verse of the Torah that if you read it, it looks like it says there are 4 different things that God did for us, gave us freedom, liberation, I forget the 4 things, and they're translated differently anyway. Blessing. And so each of these cups represents a different special blessing that God did for us. But depending on how you parse that verse, there are either 4 or 5 separate blessings. So again, there's a Mahloket. What is a Mahloket? Yes, a principled disagreement. Mahloket is a principled disagreement. There's a Mahloket of whether or not we should have 4 or 5 cups. Like most of the time, when the rabbis have a disagreement, have a Mahloket, and they say, should it be this way or that way? What is the answer? Yes. So in fact, that's exactly what we have here. The compromise they came up with, they said, okay, we will pour 5 cups, but we only drink 4 of them. So how can you pour 5 cups, but you only drink 4 of them? Well, that means you've got a cup left over. That came to be known as Elijah's cup. Why do we call it Elijah's cup? Because the rabbi said that 5th cup, we'll pour it. And if Elijah comes that year, and we see Elijah pick up the cup and drink it, we know that we were supposed to do 5 cups. If Elijah comes and says, what's this extra cup doing here? Then we'll know it was supposed to be 4. But there's no way to resolve this Mahloket until Elijah comes and solves it for us. Anytime there's a disagreement, a Mahloket, about the correct way to do something in the Talmud, it's relegated into this category of, well, we'll just have to wait for Mashiach, we'll have to wait for Elijah to come and explain the correct way to us. After that time, we'll know, but for now, we just have to do it both ways. We talked about the afikomen, the dessert, bad translation. Again, this is based on a Roman banquet. So the afikomen, although it's a Greek word, it's not a Roman word. The afikomen was the after the meal, little something that you eat, and it marks the end of the meal. We sing songs, as I mentioned, we sing lots of different songs when we sing Hallel, or in addition to Hallel. We've got Haggadah, an only kid. We've got Dayenu. We've got Who Knows One, Echad Miodeya, or in English, Who Knows One, I Know One. Look all of these songs up. They're great to learn, especially Dayenu. That's one that just every single Jewish person in the world seems to know. That's if you're going to talk about a theme song for Passover, that would be the one. When our high schoolers a week ago led a model Seder for all of our Sunday school students, and one of them came to me and said, can I lead a closing song? I said, I would love that, and said, what song should I lead? And I said, well, here are a couple of different songs. These are some different options you can choose. Gave her, probably half a dozen different options, and she said, I'll do Dayenu. That's the one that everyone knows. Let's talk about modern innovations. This Seder, if you haven't picked up on it by now, from biblical times to early rabbinic times to modern times, has gone through many different changes. The number of times we dip different vegetables, whether or not we dress up in costume and carry a walking stick, all of these different customs have changed from one era to the next. being in the modern era means that we have modern innovations that many people incorporate into their Seder. Let me talk about the orange, and I know that there was some discussion about the orange in our WhatsApp group. I'm going to ask everybody who is in the class for conversion to hang out after this is our final slide so that we can continue that conversation. But just to explain for anyone who doesn't know, in the 1970s, Susanna Heschel, who was the daughter of the famous Abraham Joshua Heschel, was traveling to Oberlin College, and there was a group of LGBT or GLBT as they called it in those days, or just GLB, that was having a Seder, and she saw in their Seder they had a crust of bread. And she said, "Why do you have a piece of bread on your plate? That invalidates the entire Seder." They said, "Well, we have been excluded from Judaism. We feel like we have as much a place in Judaism as a crust of bread on the Seder plate. So that piece of bread, that crust of bread, represents us." Well, she said, "That's no good. It's important to have a symbol to recognize that you feel excluded from the Jewish community, but you still want to be able to celebrate Passover." She said a better symbol would be an orange, which she picked specifically because an orange, you have to peel it to realize that it is divided up into sections, divided up into different demographics, so to speak, just like the Jewish community can be divided into different sections. And she said each of those sections has some seeds in it that you have to spit out in order to actually enjoy the orange. An orange is totally kosher for Passover, so you can put it on your Seder plate. But this represents the inclusion. All of those different sections of the orange still make one complete fruit. And that's how Judaism is supposed to be, one complete piece without different sections missing. By the way, in the years after this, there emerged a very, very common, and you'll still hear this today, misnomer about where the orange comes from, and it goes something like this, that it's about women becoming rabbis, and there was, when the first women were ordained, again, this was the 1970s, an Orthodox man stood up and said, "A woman belongs on the bima as much as an orange belongs on the Seder plate." And so in protest, all of the women who were about to become rabbis put an orange on their Seder plate, and that it symbolizes feminism. Shoshana Heschel, who developed this ritual, has said that she hates that explanation because, number one, it totally shifts the meaning, and number two, and most importantly, this very thoughtful innovation is relegated to an offhand comment made by a man and takes all the credit for the creation away from the women who actually created it. So you'll often see, I always grew up with an orange on my family Seder plate. I was always told that it was for women being on the bima. I was always told the wrong story. It was years before this has sort of been rehabilitated. I think now more and more people know the real story about why it's there and how it came to be there. But in reality, you'll still hear that incorrect story about women rabbis, which is a lovely story and it's inspiring to people. So if that's the story you grew up with and that's why you put an orange on your Seder plate, then continue to enjoy it. It's inspiring to you. It's meaningful to you. You'll also see Miriam's cup. We have a cup for Elijah. Many people will have a separate cup of water for Miriam, which is recognizing, we talk all about Moses during the Seder, but we don't talk very much about Miriam, who also played an extremely important role. Miriam was the one who saved, who was the reason that Moses was born in the first place, because she convinced her parents, this is in the Midrash, not in the Torah, but in the Midrash, because she convinced her parents that they should not give in to Pharaoh's decree of killing all of the children. that they should still continue to live their lives. And so Moses was born. It was Miriam who made sure that Moses was safe when he was put in a basket and taken down the river. It was Miriam who raised Moses and made sure that he knew he was a Jew. It was Miriam who rallied the people, who brought together. It was Miriam who sang and celebrated with the people after we made it across the Sea of Reeds. It was Miriam who made sure that the people had water to drink in the wilderness. Because of Miriam's well, because of her merit, that God made sure that she had water, and as a result, the entire community had water to sustain them in the wilderness. So because of all of those reasons and the fact that Miriam is left out, and Miriam doesn't have her own holiday, the way her little brother Moses does, we recognize Miriam's contribution, and in fact, the contribution of women throughout the history of Judaism. Who do you think cooked this Seder meal for 2,000 years? Almost 2,000 years. You think it was the men in the kitchen all day? Not likely. We would not have Judaism as we know it today without the contributions of women, and so Miriam's cup is a symbolic representation of Miriam the prophetess, and also of the contributions of women overlooked through Jewish history. It is a corrective, right? It's something that's been missing. It's something wrong with the ritual. So we can do a tikkun. We can repair that and change the ritual, just as the ritual has been changed throughout Jewish history. You'll also see a tomato, less common these days. In fact, in this diagram that I got from the kitchen, which is a synagogue, an experimental synagogue that's over on the West Coast, that shows these different examples, doesn't even include a tomato. That was to recognize the workers who, anybody of a certain generation remember going and smashing grapes or tomatoes for workers in the 60s, 70s, 80s? Cesar Chavez, we remember, you know, the guy that all the streets in Texas are named after. There are other timely items on here. You see olives, you see free trade chocolate and coffee, you see artichokes. These all have different symbolism to represent important issues to the people celebrating that particular Seder. You can have one or two or all of them. You can create your own, but these are rituals which are practiced in many Jewish communities in North America and around the world. Most Haggadahs, not just some, but most Haggadahs have, excuse me, have special readings. If you've, I don't have a copy here, but if you have the family Haggadah, it just says the family Haggadah, or maybe a family Haggadah. There's a whole page in there about one of the cups of wine, one of the 4 cups being dedicated to Russian immigrants. This was a major issue in the 1990s. All of these Russian Jews who were trapped in the former Soviet Union, who were trying to escape. Many of them were brought to America. Many more of them were brought to Israel, where their children are now settling. But at the time, it was very scary because nobody knew what was going to happen to these Russian Jews. People were genuinely afraid of a second Holocaust. And so there are a lot of rituals that emerged around that these were the Jews who were in Mitzrayim, who were in a narrow place and needed to be rescued. So you'll find those types of things in a lot of Haggadahs as well. You have themed Haggadahs, where the entire Haggadah follows a particular theme built around just about anything that you'd like. If you want a 5-minute Haggadah, go out there, you can find it. If you want a mystical Haggadah that emphasizes all of the mysticism, you can go out there and find it. If you want a social justice Haggadah, you can go out there and find it. Whatever kind of a special theme you want for your Passover this year. If you want a COVID-themed Haggadah, I'm sure somebody out there has released one. You can Google that. You can find all sorts of Haggadahs There's a whole website, haggadot.com or .org. You'll find it pretty quickly. That just has different Haggadahs and different special readings and special editions that you can download and use in your own Seder. That's it for the class today, but stick around if you are in this class for the purposes of conversion. Stick around for just a few minutes after we finish for the discussion that follows. Everyone else, Shavua Tov. Have a great week.